So last time we were talking about how the chronology of the Bible fits perfectly with what we know of Egypt. We went through a number of pharaohs and how they matched what we know of the biblical pharaohs. Even though we don't have their names mentioned, we do have events, characteristics, and a number of things that do match with what we have in Egyptian chronology. Very well, in fact. And as we go further, we will see further connections to these pharaohs, so try to remember their names. And we also went through how the Exodus, all those plagues that occurred about 1447 to 1446 BC, do match up with what we see in Egypt after that. And again, try to keep that in mind because over the next about 2, maybe 3 lessons, that will still come into play. We talked about how the events of the Exodus, those plagues, took about a year, and that those plagues would have fit, would have fit with the lamentation poem, the Ippawar Papyrus. And while there are things in that papyrus that are not in the biblical account, they're things that we'd expect to happen with the biblical account being accurate. So, I do want to make one more note that the Hyksos, the Semitic people living in Egypt, a little bit before and during the time of Israel, are not Israel. There is some overlap. I'm going to turn the monitor on up here. So there is some overlap. They stayed in Egypt a long time. They were both located in Goshen. They both had high places in society. Not the same high places, but both had high places. And archaeologically, we don't know how either group came in or left. Don't know if my monitor, there we go. And so there are some similarities, but there are a lot more differences. For one, the timeline is off. It requires a massive rewriting of Egyptian and or biblical history to get this to try and fit. Not a real good connection. We also note that Hyksos were rulers. They were not viziers, they were not high officials. And while there are some similar names like Jacob and Benjamin in the Hyksos dynasties, we don't see any others. And that's not the ones we'd expect. We'd expect Joseph to be up there, which we don't. We also have strong evidence of warfare between the Hyksos and the Egyptians. Don't see that anywhere in the biblical account. It does not match. And those, at least in modern day, that try to make this connection frequently will connect the plagues, the crossing of the sea, and the pillar of fire in the wilderness, all to an eruption in Greece, basically. Now, not only is the science questionable on this, this takes God completely out of the equation with these events. So it does not fit well at all. The timeline's off, the events are off. It's a very forced fit if you try to fit this. So I just want you to be aware of this out there. And while it would be nice to have all the archaeological evidence for the Hyksos be pointing to Israel, it's not a good fit for Israel. It's not a good fit. The Hyksos tried to become Egyptians. They tried to worship the Egyptian gods. Israel, if they were trying to worship their true God, wouldn't have done that. Now, the wanderings in Sinai. We're going to talk a little bit about this, but we don't have a lot of evidence for these events. But we're going to talk about it a little bit. First, Red Sea. In Hebrew, it is Yam Suf, literally sea of aquatic plants. Yam means sea. Suf could either mean S-U-P-H, meaning reed, seaweed, water, plant, etc., or Soph, S-O-P-H. Remember, the vowels were not in the original manuscripts. They just wrote the consonants. So it could be the sea of the end or the Reed Sea, but most people tend to agree that it is the Reed Sea as a literal translation. This literal translation has led some to try and say that Pharaoh's army were bogged down in some of these lakes in northern Egypt here. And while there are some things that do fit with the biblical text, they could cross easily one of these lakes in a single night. The Red Sea, on the other hand, has some passages that are 150 miles wide. You cannot cross that in a single night. But let's see if it actually fits with the biblical definition of this phrase. In 1 Kings 9:26, we have Solomon building a fleet at Ezion-Geber. That's near Aleph in the land of Edom. We know, because of these locations, that this is the Gulf of Aqaba, the eastmost Gulf of the Red Sea. In Exodus 23, Numbers 21, and Deuteronomy 1, we know that this is the Gulf of Aqaba as well. In Numbers 33, we have Israel crossing the Yam Suf, and then several days later, still camping near to Yam Suf, meaning this is a very large body of water. And even the Septuagint, this is the oldest known translation of the Hebrew manuscripts, about 300 BC, translated it into Greek. These were Hebrews, these were Israelites translating it. They translated it as Erythron Thalasson, meaning Red Sea. So everything is pointing to the Red Sea being what this phrase means. Even though it's not a literal translation, it is what fits the biblical narrative as far as its description, and even as far back as over 2,000 years ago. So we have to find the Red Sea, and we need to find an area that's short enough to cross over by foot overnight. They crossed in a single night. This is going to be difficult to find because sea levels and terrain have changed since then. There are about 4 different potential locations that are suggested in modern literature. We have the Gulf of Suez, which fits with the translation, is a proper traveling distance, but there is no archaeological evidence for this. The Gulf of Aqaba, it goes with the translation of Red Sea, but it's too far to travel. This requires Mount Sinai to be in Midian, in the land just east of the Gulf of Aqaba there in the bottom right. And that's too far to travel as far as the biblical timelines go. There's no archaeological evidence for this either. Some try to say that it was one of the lakes of Egypt, Bala Lake specifically, or Bala Lake. And this lake has actually been drained, so we can see everything in it. No archaeological evidence. The only thing that kind of supports this is there was a tower nearby, and the biblical text says that there was a tower nearby, but there's many towers, so it's not a great match. And then some try to say the Mediterranean Sea, which doesn't really match with anything except for the traveling distance. So we can't really find that out well. You'll see people trying to match it with certain things, with a piece of coral or whatnot. It's not a good match. We need to be very careful about what we try to match with the biblical text. Unfortunately, we don't have a location for the crossing, and we probably never will. This occurred 3,500 years ago. Things in water don't last very long, especially bodies of the Egyptian army and their light chariots. These were not large pieces with metal. These were light-framed chariots. They probably wouldn't have survived very long at all. Now, as far as Mount Sinai, here are the biblical requirements of Mount Sinai. We know, based upon Exodus 4, as far as how people were traveling, that it needs to be around the east-west Trans-Sinai Highway. They had highways back then. We know where they are today. It needs to be close to Midian, on the Mount Seir Road, in the wilderness of Paran, about 30 days' journey from Ramses to the Desert of Sin, which has Mount Sinai in it, an 11-day journey from Mount Sinai to Kadesh Barnea by the Mount Seir Road. It's described as being located on the back side of the desert. And while they did not take the northern route out of Egypt, the way of the Philistines, this was not because they were not able to reach Mount Sinai. They were going there. Moses was told he was going there before he even went to Egypt. He says, I'm going to take you back. God says, I'm going to take you back, and you're going to worship me here, even before he goes to Egypt. So God did not take them by that way, not because that wasn't the way they were going, but because of the warfare. He didn't want them to see war. The Egyptians had a lot of fortresses along this route. And so we know that it needs to be able to be reached by this way, but also by the way they went. Now, the traditional sign of Mount Sinai is at the bottom of the Sinai Peninsula. You can see down here where that little red box is. But it doesn't seem to be located in the wilderness of Paran. It's too far from Kadesh Barnea, which is up here. And basically, it's too far for Midian. Moses would have been tending his flocks here, his father Jethro's flocks, who was in Midian, way over here, if this map was extending out that far. That is very, very far and very poor grazing land. Plus, since this was controlled by Egypt at the time, they had mines down there. Not a good place to graze your sheep in a foreign territory. The only argument for this is tradition, because the people that set this up set up many, many other untrue pilgrimage sites that do not fit with today's scrutiny. They set them up far afterwards and seem to be doing that either for prestige or money or something like that. But they set up a number of untrue pilgrimage sites. So there's not really a lot supporting this as the site for Mount Sinai. But there are many other proposed locations. You can see here a little cursor on every proposed site, at least today. And while there are a number of extra biblical and historical notes and traditions, they do seem contradictory. Some say it was the highest peak. Some say it was the lowest peak in the range. So we don't really know. We don't know extra biblically. So we're going to be basing this purely on what is mentioned in the Bible. Thankfully, we have 2 locations as far as relation to Mount Sinai. We know that the traveling speed of the time, based upon archaeological reports, was between 7 to 15 miles a day. The 15 miles a day was by an Egyptian army along the coast of the Mediterranean Sea, meaning easy travel because of good terrain. They were also an army, so they did not have large groups of herds, probably not that many women, and hopefully no children in this army. So they probably were able to travel very, very fast. They also would not have stopped on the Sabbaths like the Israelites most likely would have. So we can compare the Kadesh Barnea as well as Ramses the Ramses city that they left, Avaris, and get a timeline travel. So the top picture, the blue circle is the 7 miles per hour timeline. The larger gray circle is the 15 miles per day timeline. That is from the city of Avaris, of P. Ramses, where they would have left, the land of Goshen. So we're looking more likely for something in that blue circle on the top. Kadesh Barnea, an 11-day journey from there. The larger circle, the blue on the bottom there, is the 15 miles per day travel distance. And this is going in a straight line. This is as the crow flies, not these winding desert paths. So likely to have been much shorter than that. The gray circle inside that would have been the 7 miles per day traveling distance. So we're most likely looking for something that is crossing the blue circle on the top and the gray circle on the bottom. That means the best possible location today for Mount Sinai is a mountain called Gebel Qasim et Tarif. This is located right here where that square is. There were a limited number of roads to travel through this wilderness. We have the Trans-Sinai Highway, this one here, and the Mount Seir Road, this one here. And right where they cross, we have this mountain pretty close. And you can actually drive by this today. The picture at the bottom, that's a road right there. So you can drive by and see it. And so we know that it's near these routes based upon the traveling of the people in this area. They would have used these routes to travel. And so at this mountain, we have a number of graves indicating that this was a potentially holy site by these people. They would have an important site. They would have buried people at an important site. We have animal figures at the base that potentially seem to map out 12 possible encampments around the mountain, which might be the limit for the people around the mountain, but this is a very tenuous connection. It just as well might not be. There is a rectangular structure on the south side. It fits the travel distance and the location. There is a cleft, and this evidence, again, is not conclusive. This is a loose fit, but it is the best fit that we have with the data we have, and it's worth further examination. You can see here the cleft with the person in it. These are the markers there, the little animal figures, and you can see them mapped out here with the mountain, and a number of graves you can see here. So it is the best fit we have, and it is very difficult to do any archaeological research here, but archaeologists have went and gotten some data, and so far it looks good. But we cannot say for sure that this is Mount Sinai of the Bible. But it is, again, the best chance we have, the best option we have today. We need to be careful about what we link to the biblical account. Because if we say this is for sure Mount Sinai and that we're wrong, then that doesn't mean that we're wrong, it means the Bible's wrong. So we need to be very careful. And in that vein, there is another potential Mount Sinai called Jabal al-Lawz. This is over in Saudi Arabia here. This was discovered by a person named Ron Wyatt. He was a nurse anesthesiologist or anesthetist, I forget which, but basically he was in the medical field. Suddenly quit his job and decided to go out, and he found over hundreds of biblical artifacts and locations. That is very suspicious in and of itself. And a lot of these are very dubious discoveries. He was the one that supposedly found this mountain, and unfortunately the data is not good, but many people will promote this. You'll find videos on YouTube saying, this is Mount Sinai, this is Mount Sinai. But we need to be careful about what we say is or isn't connected to the Bible, because if we are wrong, we're not just wrong, the Bible is wrong then in other people's eyes. They say they found a land bridge, they say they found bitter wells, 12 springs. They just find stuff and they try to connect it with no real connection other than that, oh look, there's a spring, it must be this spring. There is a cave of Moses and Jethro that they claim, but this cave is actually a Nabatean tomb from the 200s AD, not even the same period, not even the same millennia. We have a supposed altar for the golden calf, which is really just a big boulder, and while there are cows carved on it, there are over 300 cows carved in this area, not just on this one boulder. And if Moses were to destroy the gold calf with such intensity as he is described, why didn't he just cross out these images of cows? There's supposed altar of Moses with 12 pillars, but there's only Nabatean pottery found around here, not Semitic pottery, not even Egyptian pottery. And they will claim that the blackened top is still charred from the fire. It's not charred, it is a different kind of rock. That's all it is. Unless you're trying to say God transmuted one rock to another by fire, then what kind of rock are you even looking for? You cannot say that proves the biblical text, because then you'd be looking for any kind of rock then, and the biblical text doesn't even say that. So we need to be very, very careful about what we try to connect to the Bible. And so a lot of this stuff that we're covering right now are most likelies, potentials, good things to follow for the next few decades because we're finding more and more, but just be careful about what you say for sure is connected. Now, as far as the wanderings go, this occurred about 3,500 years ago. So we're not really likely to find anything. They built no lasting structures, their food and water was taken care of by God, even their shoes and clothes didn't wear out. So we're not even going to find a trash trail by these people. They didn't really have many battles, and we don't even know where they were. The biblical account gives us a few locations, but for the vast majority of the wanderings, we don't know where they were. So it's very hard to find a place and say this was for sure the Israelites when we're not going to find much there that has survived, let alone be able to connect it to them, since we don't know where they were the entire time. And so we need to make sure that we know when we should find something and when we shouldn't. That being said, there are a number of inscriptions by the Egyptians. We have one. This was a Ramses II temple that lists the nomads of Yahweh. This was discovered in the 1930s. The more interesting one, though, is a temple by Amenhotep III. He was the successor of Amenhotep II, the pharaoh of the Exodus. And he was building a temple at Soleb. This is located in modern Sudan or ancient Nubia. Discovered in the 1950s, and it lists a lot of his enemies. Now, if they had no city, they were simply named by the gods they worshipped. And so this dates to about the late 1400s, so that would mean 1401, 1402, not like late as we use it today. Remember, they're counting down with the BC numbers. So Israel would have been near the end of the wanderings, east, south of Israel, give or take. And this is the oldest known mention of Yahweh in the archaeological record as of 2019. I've not found any more recent. So this inscription reads, "Of the lands of Shasu, nomadic marauders of Yahweh." They didn't like them, obviously. They were their enemies. But they were located north of Egypt, just east of Canaan, living in tents because they were nomads. Now, scholars can't even say this isn't Yahweh. This is obviously the name Yahweh. So they try to say that this isn't the Israelites, even though they're right where the Bible says they would be. This is the Kenites or the Edomites, but there's no evidence in these cultures that they ever worshiped Yahweh. You cannot say that these were these people when they didn't really worship Yahweh. Yet we have a people in this location that worshiped Yahweh, the Israelites. For half a century, it has been generally admitted that we have here the Tetragrammaton, the name of the Israelite God, Yahweh. And if this be the case, as it undoubtedly is, the passage constitutes most precious indication of the whereabouts during the late 15th century BC of an enclave revering this God. If you want to know more about this, you can find a video on it on sourceflix.com. They have a lot of good videos there on some of these archaeological finds, but this is very interesting and is probably one of the best evidence of the Israelites and their wanderings. Now, we do have some other inscriptions, but these are a bit more uncertain as far as their relation to Israel. But they do have a very strong connection to Israel in another sense. These inscriptions, I showed you one before, but they were found in the wilderness of Sinai, down near here, because the Egyptians had a turquoise mine down there. They would go down there, send slaves, and they would mine it out. And we find stones with writing on it. For example, we have this one here. It reads, "The overseer of minerals, Ahisamach." There's another inscription there. The one having elevated is weary to forget. So two inscriptions, but one mentions Ahisamach. I'm assuming I'm pronouncing that right, probably not, but we'll see. Exodus 31:6 says, "And behold, I have appointed with him Oholiab, the son of Ahisamach of the tribe of Dan." This is one of the people that was responsible for building the things of the tabernacle. So it makes sense that his father would have been in the same line of work, overseer of minerals. So this could be the same exact man, Ahisamach, or it could simply mean that we have another Ahisamach in this time period, which is what we expect, meaning again that the writings of the Exodus occurred in this time period. Another strong support for that, potentially even the same person. We can't say that for sure, though. But what's very interesting is that these inscriptions are showing the Hebrew language beginning to be developed as far as written language, and to a lesser extent, our own. So these are the modern Hebrew block letters. You can see then the Proto-Hebrew original letters, Middle Egyptian hieroglyphics, and then what each one represents as far as cattle, house, and so on. So this is what they did. They took a hieroglyph that was basically a picture, so a picture of a boat. That then picture would represent the syllable B, the B sound. And then over time, you wouldn't be drawing the cow head anymore, you'd be drawing basically an A. And that is where we get our A from. This alphabet went to Canaan, went to Phoenicia, went to Greece, went to Latin, went to ours. This is our development, the development of our alphabet here, and is the same alphabet that Moses would have likely used. The original Pentateuch was likely written in these letters here. And we can see this developing at the time where Israel was in Egypt. They may have been a part of the development of it, or it may have been other Semitic peoples in there. But we know that this is where they got their writing from, either developing it or just taking it. And it is just interesting that many people have said over and over again that writing was in existence. Yet here we see the language actually developing, the first alphabet being developed, our own alphabet being developed. We have a number of other inscriptions. Try to read it here. He sought occasion to cut away to barrenness our great number, our swelling without measure. They yearned for Hathor, but the quiver of our brothers was thoroughly despised. So he performed terror against their quiver and brought about a cry of wailing. Some have tried to say that this is a reference to the Israelite male children being killed by Egypt, only for Egypt then to die, their children to die. And it could be that this was written by one of the Israelites or one of the peoples taken with them. It's mentioning this. So not a strong connection, but a potential connection. We have this one here that seems to actually mention the name Moses. Our bond servitude had lingered. Moses then provoked astonishment. It is a year of astonishment because of the lady. This could be the oldest record of the name Moses. And it may be the Moses of the Bible, or it may be a different Moses. Again, we cannot say that for sure, but it does fit with provoking astonishment. The lady could be Hatshepsut, the daughter of Pharaoh who drew him out of the Nile, since she, at this time, seems to have underwent a desecration campaign, if you remember that. But at the very least, for sure, this shows that Moses, the name Moses, was in this time period, showing that the chronology of the Bible is accurate. So overall, we have a very strong connection to Egyptian history with the Bible. It all fits very, very well, even more so when we start considering some of the findings in the Levant, in the land of Canaan. We have Ahmose the first being the Pharaoh that started enslaving Israel. We have Tutmosis the third that sought to kill Moses. Hatshepsut was likely the daughter of Pharaoh that raised him up, and Amenhotep II was the Pharaoh of the Exodus. It all fits very well. We have a number of other writings that, at the very least, support this. The Ipuwer Papyrus, all the Sinai inscriptions, the Solomon inscription, all this fits. And while one piece alone does not prove, when we start getting many, many pieces, it gets a stronger and stronger case for a match with the biblical account. That being said, there are some pieces that are a very loose match. The Mount Sinai, the Red Sea crossing, so be very careful before you connect certain things to the Bible. For else, if you are wrong, then the Bible will be further discredited because of your mistake. So you can say most likely, say this is a good candidate, but you cannot say for sure unless there is a lot of evidence. Now, as far as resources go, we have a number of resources here, SourceFlix, Appian Media, some good videos if you like that, if you're a visual learner. We have a number of other archaeological websites here that you can get a lot of good information on. Otherwise, that's it for this lesson. Can you bring up the next one? So now that we are in the promised church building, we finally get into the promised land. I like how that matches up. So for the next 2, maybe 3 lessons, we're going to be talking about Joshua, Judges, and 1 Samuel. It took us about 2 months to get through the book of Genesis. We're going to only speed up from that. So take notes, and next time you start to read through some of these books, refer back to these notes so you can judge if they're accurate or not. Unfortunately, we cannot do that in real time. So an overview is basically that Israel enters the land east of the Jordan. They conquer that, and then they cross the Jordan. Israel then destroys and conquers a number of cities. Israel then divides the land, but does not fully conquer the land. They don't conquer everything in the time of Joshua. We have a number of people fighting back, most notably the Philistines at the time of the Judges. All this time, though, the Ark and the Tabernacle reside mainly at Shiloh. But Israel falls into disrepute religiously and abandons the Lord. So now, as far as Canaan goes, as far as the time of all this occurring, During this time period, during the time of the judges, during the time of 1 Samuel, we have the same culture on both sides of the Jordan. We can see that based upon the things they use, like this Pithos storage jar. Now, this means that either one, they shared a culture, or two, they were the same nation. So this is consistent with Israel coming in and conquering these lands. Now, there are a number of other people on the Transjordan side, Edom, Moab, the Ammonites, all related to Israel through their ancestors. The Amorites, though, ones are not, and they therefore are defeated. Eventually, the tribes of Reuben, Gad, and half of Manasseh settle here, and they are the first ones to be taken by Nebuchadnezzar in the deportation. That's basically all we're going to be talking about these people on the Transjordan. There's not really a lot of focus there because they don't play a large role in a lot of things. We'll mention them, but our main focus is going to be on the land in actual Canaan, on the the west side of the Jordan. So, once they get all those lands conquered, Joshua then sends out spies. A few days later, they then cross the Jordan. They then quickly destroy Jericho and Ai, and then after a number of other conquers, they destroy Hazor. These are the only biblical cities listed as far as destructions. So these are the only places we'd expect to see the destruction noted. They didn't come in and kill off everyone. They didn't destroy all the cities. Now, they destroyed some cities and they killed off the people there, but we know from the biblical text they didn't conquer everywhere. And even the places that they did conquer, they took them in as slaves and sometimes against the commandment of God. But we have a number of destruction sites all through Israel, all through this land. And so there are a few conflicts. People try to move one destruction layer to another time period saying it was these people, saying it was Egypt or the Ammonites or even Babylon when they came in, the Syrians. And so we need to make sure that we are talking about the correct place as well as the correct time period. So the first thing we're going to be talking about is the city of Jericho, or Tel Es Sultan today. Now, everyone seems to agree on this location, at least archaeologists do anyway. Both biblical archaeologists and secular archaeologists. Now, this is a low elevation zone, meaning it's going to be hot here. It's also an earthquake zone. It's in the Jordan Rift Valley, about 10 miles northwest of the Dead Sea. It is a perfect place to come into the land of Canaan, and as such, it was likely involved in trade routes and defense of the land. It existed long before the time of Joshua, but this is not the New Testament Jericho. That is built slightly in a different location. But the Old Testament Jericho had one of the largest freshwater springs in all the southern Levant. And now, it was occupied as far back as the 1900s BC. This was before the time of Abram. And these people were semi-nomadic and lived in tents. Eventually, the Amorites came in. They built up a big city there because of all the trade revenue, because this was a great place to enter the land. They built massive walls and built a great fortification. Now, Jericho of the time of Joshua, archaeologically, we can see the houses that they built here. They were small, irregular houses. They had two main roads in there that were shallow cobblestones, and there was a large number of jars they found filled with grain. Now, we can see the paths they traveled, the way they lived, their storerooms, their shops, and even that they lived above these. So they had the shops on the bottom and their living quarters on top. Now, secular scientists will claim that because ABC isn't there, that means the Bible is inaccurate. This is an argument from science. It's not a good argument, especially since every time we do find the data, it seems to agree with what the Bible says. Or they will try to straw man the biblical account. They will say that Israel came in and leveled everywhere. They killed off everyone, destroyed everything, we should see a massive crater. That's not what the Bible says. And so, since we don't see that, they then try to say that the Bible is wrong. So these are the main two ways in which the Bible is attacked archaeologically. Now, we all agree, both secular and biblical scientists agree, that this is the Jericho of the Bible, of the Old Testament. But there is a disagreement about the pottery. There is one thing that we disagree about. And because of this one little detail, they miss everything else. Everything else that they found, they even admit agrees with the Bible. But because of this one detail, it doesn't fit chronologically for them. So they throw out the Bible entirely because of this one detail, not questioning if this one detail could be wrong or could be misassumed because of their assumptions. They say that King Josiah came in or sent a scribe to Jericho to make up a story so that Israel had a grand history, basically just backdating and making propaganda. We'll see if that's correct. There have been a number of excavations, even as far back as 1868, and they've had some different findings. For one, basically the first guy didn't think there was anything to really be found here. He was wrong. But we had a German expedition, Josh Garnstang of the 1930s, and then Kathleen Kenyon of the 1950s. These are going to be the main expeditions because they were the biggest. Now, Kathleen Kenyon is the one that is most quoted by secular scientists, by archaeologists. And she did a number of things. For one, she correctly redated a certain building to 1560, but she also redated the destruction of the city to the end of the Middle Bronze Age too, basically 1560 as well. This is about 150 years, almost 200 years before the time of Joshua. And so there is some concern about this one thing that she redated. And I want to make a note here that science, even archaeology, is not immune from politics. Archaeology perhaps more so. Because not only are they subject to their own government, they are subject to the government of where they want to dig. Israel is a very political state right now. You have a number of major groups all arguing over what should and shouldn't be the case. Now, when you try to get the permission, they want to make sure that you're going to give them what they want and promote their view. And so it is very difficult to do anything there. And you have to do a lot of red tape, and it is just a mess. I am thankful I don't have to deal with that. But we need to make sure that we take all this politics into consideration whenever we hear about certain findings in the land of Israel. Now, in Jericho, in the 1950s, Kathleen Kenyon found a number of things. Now, she's a great field archaeologist. She's great about getting things out. But all of her other sites, she has shown that she has poor analytical skills. She doesn't make good analyses. At all of her other sites where she's dug, her conclusions were rejected, meaning that the archaeological community does not agree with her. Yet for this one site, they tried to. And so this puts her assumptions, her conclusions, into question, since everywhere else she is wrong. So let's look at what she found. Her discoveries were based upon pottery, her conclusions were based upon pottery, but she didn't really publish a lot about her analysis of the pottery she found. Now, pottery is critical for dating sites, for understanding if a site is present or not. Now, Canaanites lived there, so we'd expect to find Canaanite pottery, and we did. We found a lot of local pottery from the late Bronze I period. Even Kathleen Kenyon found that. But she basically ignored it. She concluded that the city was destroyed 150 years prior to Joshua, contradicting people before and after her. And this is because there was no imported pottery from Cyprus. Cyprus is a place in the Mediterranean Sea. And Jericho is a landlocked city. You would not expect to find much imported stuff from so far away. And so she concluded that since there was no imported pottery, that Jericho was not inhabited at the time of Joshua. Yet, even though she says that, she also says the destruction was complete. Walls and floors were blackened or reddened by fire, and every room was filled with fallen bricks, timbers, and household utensils. In most of the rooms, the fallen debris was heavily burnt, but the collapse of the walls of the eastern room seemed to have taken place before they were affected by fire. Everything else she found, she even admits in her analyses, well, doesn't admit that she doesn't admit that they agree with the Bible, but you can see by her description that they do. So everything else she found agrees with the Bible, but because of no imported pottery, she tries to say that there was no one there, despite having a lot of Canaanite pottery. So the pottery that she found and others found looked something like this. It was used for storage of everything and cooking and just basically all throughout daily life. They have certain ceramic markers, and you can know where pottery is from and when it was made based upon this. The same way today, I'm sure my wife can, I know for sure, but I'm sure other women in the audience can look at an appliance, look at a bowl, look at a dish, and say, oh, that's so last generation, that's so 1990s. I can't tell the difference. I'd be a bad archaeologist. But we use that same method to basically get certain periods in time. And then once we have a good calibrator, a good site that shows that this period had this pottery, we can then use that to date other sites. And so we use this. We also have scarabs. Now, this is why you need to remember those ancient Egyptian names we talked about, those pharaohs. Scarabs are beetles. Well, they're carvings of beetles, I should say. On one side, you have a beetle or something like that. On the other side, you either have a name, or as you can see up here, an emblem. basically like a coat of arms. And this would be used for a number of things. Used to show your patriotism, like us having little American flags. Used to show authority, stamping stuff as far as seals, or sometimes the even collection. You can see here, they have an emblem from Tutmos III, another one down here, Hatshepsut, and Amenhotep III. Now, these occurred prior to the Exodus. This one here. If you remember, he's the one that made that inscription in Soleb. So this occurred well after the Exodus. So you don't date it based upon the oldest one, because they can keep that there for centuries even. You date it by the latest one, by the one that was most recent. And so we know that that one couldn't have popped in there after the fact because he wasn't written, everything was already buried. And so we can name them. I'm getting a lot of feedback. Ellie, can you turn me down just a little bit? Thank you. So we can name the time period based upon pottery as well as other things like scarabs. Now, as far as the walls go, Jericho is built on something called a tell. This isn't what you do when you're playing poker or anything like that. A tell is basically a mound. So they'd build a city. They would then decide to refurbish things. They would take things down to near the foundation, fill that in with dirt, fill, and other trash, and then use that as the foundation for the next building. After you do this a few dozen, maybe even 100 times, you're going to get a mountain, basically, a good mound. And that's what Jericho is. It has existed for centuries prior to Joshua. And so you're going to have all these buildings built one on top of another, not leaving much behind but the foundation and an outline of the building, and trash in there. Trash is the archaeologist's best friend. And so based upon this, we can see how they existed, how they lived. We can also see that they had three technically massive walls. We have a 15-foot high retaining wall down here, that little gray thing next to a man. On top of that, we had a 2-meter wide by 6 to 7 meter high mud brick wall and another one up top. So that means this whole thing would have been over 30 feet high, followed by a steep incline and another massive wall. This would have been a very defensive city. But when the walls fell down, they fell beneath themselves. And that is literally what the Bible says. Your Bible may be translated that they fell flat. But literally it says they fell beneath themselves. And then Israel went up into the city. And this is exactly what we find archaeologically. You can even see pictures there of the wall, because the retaining wall is still there. That did not fall down. We've actually excavated that, and quite a bit of the mud brick wall that has fallen. And so in the process of falling, the mud brick wall made a ramp, allowing the Israelites to run up this ramp over the retaining wall and into the city. Exactly with what the Bible literally says. And every major expedition has found evidence of this. You can see there a drawing of it. This is actually from Kathleen's discovery herself. So you can see the mud brick wall here and the retaining wall here that fell down. And you can see they haven't dug all the way around, but they have dug a number of sites that reveal this. We even have a section of the wall that did not fall down. It's not all there because of time and wear and stuff like that, but we still have a wall partially up that did not fall with houses right next to it. Now, Joshua 2:15 talks about how Rahab lived next to the wall. That was kind of difficult to translate because did she live in the wall, against the wall, or near the wall? Well, basically, we see archaeologically that the houses were built right up next to the wall. So you can see here the house, and here's the wall and the retaining wall. And this was only found in one area on the north side by the German excavation. It doesn't look like there's much there of this wall, but that's actually 9 feet high. That's how tall the wall was.
Did you say 9?
Yes, 9 feet high. And so based upon this remnant, we can then figure out how tall the wall actually was all the way around. It's all a house built right up next to it. And this may be Rahab's house, or it may just simply be another house. We can't connect Rahab to this house specifically, other than the fact that it's an area that was not destroyed. We know Rahab's house was an area that was not destroyed. But we see all the things required for normal domestic life, all the instruments they would have used. So even if this isn't Rahab's house, this confirms that the biblical account was an eyewitness to these events, not something that came out later. When King Josiah would have sent his people here to make a story, if the secular scientists are right, he would not have seen any of this. The walls that would have fell would have been underground. He couldn't see that. He couldn't see how the walls fell down and they would have went up to the city. It was all a pile of rubble covered by dirt. So their explanation does not fit. These key details could have only fit if they saw them happen themselves. Even the fire, we have massive amounts of ash, 4 to 5 feet in some places. You can see here the actual ash and a representation of it there in the red. We can see this all over. This was a massive destruction. And there was grain in this. We see grain, numerous jars full of grain, particularly barley. These are all late Bronze I jars, jars from the time of Joshua, filled with scorched grain. And this means a few different things. For one, it means the Bible wasn't just accurate as far as which year, but the time of year. Joshua came in right after the Passover. They celebrated the Passover after crossing the Jordan, and they came into Jericho after that. The time of the Passover is the time of barley harvest in the Jordan Valley, meaning Jericho had enough time to go out, harvest their barley, come in, and then Israel attacked. This shows that the Bible is specific, incredibly specific as far as its events. And we know that since there was grain there, this was not a long siege. We know the walls fell first, then the fire, and that there was not food eaten, and all of this was left, meaning that it was not a long siege, because otherwise they would have eaten their food, and the city was not ransacked, because they would have taken the food. You can see there the quote again from Kathleen. So in summary, the walls fell just like the Bible says. The fire occurred just like the Bible says. The city was not plundered just like the Bible says. The houses were built against the wall. Audience participation.
Just like the Bible says.
Thank you. The siege of the city was short.
Just like the Bible says.
The attack happened in the spring.
Just like the Bible says. Come on, people.
The Israelites went up into the city.
Just like the Bible says.
But how did those walls fall? Those walls fell by faith. And I'm hoping that with these studies that we can strengthen your faith so that you can have faith to have these walls fall. Not the literal walls, but the walls that may prevent you from sharing some of these things, from talking to people about the gospel. I'm hoping that this can solidify your faith and that you can have faith that tear down those walls that separate you, that separate the gospel from each other. Thank you.